This is a tremendous work of research, and it's maybe some people in the room know this history in this kind of detail, but I'd be surprised, and I certainly didn't. And it's just an amazing research through contemporaneous notes and diaries and letters, and I want to talk to you all about that later. But first, it's a tough story, but it's also a personal story, and maybe it'd be good to talk about where this started for you, where this project started for you.
Yeah, so then we can also kind of talk a little bit about our relationship. Matt's my
That's right.
former boss, and
I'll be doing his annual review at the end of this.
and plays a role in this, actually. So
Why do you think I asked this question first?
You're in the acknowledgments along with Dean Baquet. So the incident that you're talking about, this was October 2016. This was just a couple of weeks away from Trump's election, and it was just a Sunday afternoon after church, and a group of friends of mine were on the Upper East Side, 68th, 69th in Lexington, and there was a group of us, all Asian American, who were kind of blocking the sidewalk, trying to decide where to go for lunch. And this woman, I described her as kind of like a well-dressed woman who looked like she could have been a mom at my kid's preschool, brushed past us and was really aggravated that this large group of Asian Americans was blocking her way. And she said, as she passed us, "Go back to China." And it was after church, and I should have turned the other cheek. I'm not proud of this part that was in me that abandoned my younger daughter in her stroller, and I ran down the street after her and kind of got in her face. And I was basically just kind of going back and forth and saying, like, "Are you serious? Did you just say that?" And we kind of exchanged words. She took out her phone. She was like threatening to film me. And I walked away, and she screamed down the street, "Go back to your fucking country." And I was, the adrenaline's running. I was trying to think of something to say smart in return. And I said, "I was born in this country." It was so pathetic. Right. And so this was the heyday of Twitter, and I was shaken, and we went to this restaurant, and I was kind of live tweeting what happened, and I used the hashtag this is 2016, just kind of this observation that this was still happening as the year 2016, and that went viral. Like, it went just like, this is the kind of explosiveness of social media. And it was this thing where, like, all these people were responding. Obviously, it resonated with people. Bill de Blasio tweeted back at me, kind of thing, like he's showing his progressive bona fides, and he was like, you're welcome in the city, or something like that. Like, the only thing that has no place in this city is that kind of, talk. And then I was part of, I led an investigative team at the Times, but I was part of this interesting cross-desk initiative on race, and I was an editor. I didn't write usually. I edited Rachel Swarns, who was sitting in the front row, Montclair resident, incredible historian and reporter and writer, and she was the one who. I think I can't remember if you texted me or emailed me, and me and Mark Lacey, who also another former Montclair resident, now lives in Manhattan, and said, "Mike, you should write about this." And and then Mark's idea was to do it as an open letter to this woman, and so I just like banged out this thing that's just kind of. I wrote to the woman who yelled at my family to go back to China, and And I kind of wrote about this this feeling of otherizing that is common in the Asian American experience, and has been and tried to explain a little bit of the history of this. And I also wrote about this this sadness I felt as I was walking home that day, pushing my daughter in the stroller, and had my older daughter next to me, just thinking about whether my parents were born in mainland China, went to Taiwan, came to the United States in the 1960s, 70s. So my kids are 2 generations removed from the immigrant experience, and just thinking about whether they would ever feel like they truly belonged in this country. And so I wrote about that. The way you enter the story is, you know, that we published that piece, and that, you know, really accelerated and went viral, and then I was at the Page One meeting the next day, and I was pitching Metro's stories, and then we talked about this. I don't remember who brought it up, but you made the decision. I think it was you made the decision to put it on the front page of the print newspaper, which is a really big deal. For like, because of the subject matter, because of the way it was written, it was really unusual decision. And then that led to this kind of week-long kind of conversation. People filmed videos and sent in videos of their own experiences. That went viral. Somebody recognized me at Barnes and Noble's. They're like, "Are you that guy from that video?" And so the way this was just the seed of this. And for a couple of weeks, I joke I was the face of Asian America. I was on MSNBC. I did all these interviews, media interviews. People were writing about it. And I was at a panel at Columbia on race, and I was invited because of this happened to me. And Jelani Cobb, who is now my colleague at The New Yorker, who is a historian by training, went before me on this panel. If you know Jelani, he speaks in these extraordinary full paragraphs of context and history about the Black experience, and is so deep and insightful. And I was just this guy who had this horrible thing happen to me. And I felt a bit of imposter syndrome, and just kind of this, it stuck in me that I actually don't know my history, our history in that way. And then I went to The New Yorker. I had a very busy day job, and the pandemic happened. And then, actually very similar to the birth of AAPI Montclair and New Jersey, the Atlanta spa attacks happened in April of 2021. And I wrote a piece for The New Yorker that that kind of talked about this history of anti-Asian violence, and really focused on this period known as the driving out, which happened in 1884, 1885, when nearly 200 communities in the American West expelled the Chinese from their midst. I venture to say that I never heard of this period. And so that's what led to, a couple months later, I signed the contract to do this book, and I've been on this journey ever since.
Before we get to the driving out, because the story starts differently, right? The Chinese are welcome to the country, right?
Yeah.
There's even like actually like a public welcoming event.
A parade, yeah.
In San Francisco, right?
Yeah.
What is it,
1848, yeah, 1848. So 49, yeah.
And the governor of California, right? He favors the Fugitive Slave Act.
Yep.
But he's welcoming the Chinese.
Yes.
So I mean, it's a whole other issue we'll get into later.
Yeah.
But so it starts in a very different way than the story unfolds later, right?
Yeah. I mean
China itself is in a rough time during that period, right?
Yeah. So the Chinese came during the gold rush, and that was the first large scale, there were individual Chinese that were here and there before 1849, but not in large numbers. And they started to come as did the rest of the world, this kind of global migration to the West Coast, which really produced this unprecedented experiment in multiracial democracy that, they were, obviously white Americans, immigrants from every country in Europe, indigenous people, Black Americans, formerly enslaved Black Americans.
All
Yeah,
mining.
all arriving here in San Francisco or in the kind of gold mining towns. And initially there was this, the mayor and some kind of the clergy in the city of San Francisco held this ceremony, kind of welcomed the Chinese because they were interested in evangelizing the Chinese. And there's actually the Daily Alta, which is like the kind of biggest newspaper in California at the time, kind of wrote this article kind of predicting that one day, like, they'll be in the halls of Congress and the way they kind of described celestials, as they called them. But then as the numbers started to grow.
When does that turn? Because they also obviously very involved in building the railroads, right? I mean,
Yeah. So
probably the part most people do.
Yeah, that's the two things that people know are the railroad and Chinese
Right.
Chinese Exclusion Act. So the railroad.
But so when do things turn? I mean, it's basically becomes a labor issue, right?
Yeah. So there was this moment after the building of the railroad that there could have been a window, like you started to see some of the way the Chinese were depicted and praised for their. This was like. The vast majority of workers, like 20,000, Chinese were working to produce the western half of the transcontinental railroad. And at first the folks who ran the Central Pacific were skeptical that the Chinese could lift the sledgehammers to to do this kind of work. And then they couldn't actually find enough white workers to do it. And then they're they started to try Chinese, and then they just started to hire them, and they became almost the entire workforce. And there was this kind of period when there could have been an opening, I feel like. But the railroad actually didn't wind up kind of producing the benefits that a lot of people thought it would in California. And there was an economic downturn.
In the railroad itself.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Like actually, it
immediately.
ended up producing there's more competition for factories in California and San Francisco, and so there was this economic downturn that took place in the 1870s.
And that's where things really began to sour, right?
Yeah, and that's when there were legions, thousands of white working men, as they called them, who were unemployed or who really started to, get restive.
Right. I mean, there were a lot of laborers coming.
Yeah.
But there were also also a relationship between the United States and China happening on this other level. And I just thought maybe telling the story of Young Wing.
Yeah.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
different from a lot of what else was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, the one thing that's maybe worth mentioning is, there is this kind of class. Another big thing was this Burlingame Treaty that took place in late 1860s, which actually was a treaty signed between the United States and China, where they agreed to kind of there would be free immigration between the two countries.
That's that's an amazing story, right? Because there's this guy named Anson Burlingame who's sent as a U.S. diplomat to China, right? And then his term is up or whatever.
Yeah,
and then something surprising happens.
Yeah, they ask him. So he's about to leave.
The Chinese.
Yeah,
right?
he's about to leave. He's this guy from the Midwest, and he ends up as the ambassador to China. And he, as he's leaving, the Chinese actually ask him to be their kind of emissary to the West. And there's this delegation a diplomatic delegation that kind of travels to the United States and then actually onward to Europe, led by this guy Anson Burlingame, and
as a Chinese official now. Right.
And he signed, and then so they signed this treaty. This guy William Seward, who's the Secretary of State, who was actually interested and believes in kind of this free interchange and believes in the possibility of trade with Asia, and also again interested in opening China to Western missionaries. So that actually leads, that treaty helped kind of the numbers start to really bump up at that point, and then it runs headlong into this economic downturn. And oh, on Young Wing's story is fascinating. Like he graduated from Yale in 1848, the first Asian immigrant to graduate from an American university. He was this um, he attended a school in China run by an American missionary, and when that missionary returned to the United States, he was about getting ready to return to the United States, he asked the students that he taught, the Chinese students, does anyone want to come with him? And he's like 13, and he like raises his hand, and then and so he ends up at Yale. There's this incredible story that it's actually there was I remember there was an article about it in the New York Times, and there's this
back then.
Yeah. There was this actually I think it was decades later where someone remembered this. It was in one of the archives that I found of it. There's like this. They had this football game between like the freshmen and sophomores, I think. But football back then, I guess, looked like more like rugby, and there's like this kind of scrum, and then Young Wing was off to the side, and the ball squirts loose, and then he grabs it and he just runs, and it scores,
right?
score, and it like was led to this like upset. The freshman won, and so anyway, so he returned to China with this idea of helping his country, which was, as you mentioned, China was kind of a struggling country at that point.
Humiliation.
Yeah, period. Yeah, humiliation, and so he had this vision that he would bring students like him, and bring them to the United States to study in the United States, and so in this kind of period when this restiveness is starting to happen in the 1870s, 120 Chinese boys come to New England, where there aren't very many Chinese. They were just starting to have some groups of them arrive, and they stay with host families. Young Wing himself actually ends up marrying a white woman who was kind of one of the single women who hosted some boys, and they really become integrated, and it's to the point that some were becoming Christians, which actually disturbed the Chinese officials, and what ended up kind of happening was both that there was concern in the Chinese government about the Americanization of these boys, and then there was related to the kind of anti-Chinese movement. One of the things that the Chinese wanted was that when these boys went to college, they wanted to be able to study at Annapolis and West Point as kind of part of what they would bring back to China. And because of the anti-Chinese movement that was growing at that point, they said that that was kind of shut down. And so they too were kind of victims of this. And so the boys end up going back, and actually, a few of them ended up staying and kind of, had their incredible stories themselves. Young Wing ends up, he had become kind of a diplomat for China, and then he ends up going back. And he ends up, so he has, he had, boys, American-born boys he ends up actually essentially, when he went on one of his trips back to China, they discover that he's an American citizen, and so he had actually managed to become an American citizen, a naturalized American citizen.
Pretty rare, right?
Yeah,
Very rare.
around when he was at Yale, and the reason why that was so unusual is the naturalization was governed by this law that passed in 1790 that says that reserves the naturalization to people who have lived here for a certain number of years and are white people of good moral character. And so there was a question of how do the Chinese fit into that? And at that point, it was kind of up to individual judges. And so Young Wing found a judge in Connecticut who granted him citizenship. So then he's in China. This is like early 20th century at this point. Or was it late 19th century? Anyways, after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which we have to get to, but that law explicitly barred Chinese from becoming American citizens. And so they're like, hey, he shouldn't be an American citizen. So they revoked his passport. But he somehow found a way back into the United States and essentially kind of died this very kind of lonely kind of death. And it's kind of like, I kind of describe him as a man without a country. And so in that way, he's like, I love that chapter.
Great story. Yeah.
I love that chapter because there's actually also there's a little bit of palate cleanser because there's a lot of violence in this book.
Right.
A lot of, and you need.
He dies a natural death, which is not true of everyone else in the book.
But also there is a little bit of the kind of model minority sort of thing going on. And despite his kind of best efforts he speaks English, married a white woman, somehow, not ever sort of fully, being accepted.
So while this is going on in New Haven or whatever, but on the West Coast, things are really turning bad, right? I mean, there's, and I just was struck by this quote from this guy, John Franklin Miller.
Senator John Franklin Miller, yes.
Right. There's always a Miller from California who's got some nasty things to say about immigrants, but
no relation to Stephen Miller. I checked on that.
To him. I don't know where you came up with that.
Yeah.
As
far as I know.
You want to read it?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Were the Chinese to amalgamate at all with our people, it would be the lowest, most vile, and degraded of our race, and the result of our amalgamation would be a hybrid of the most despicable, a mongrel of the most detestable that has ever afflicted the earth. This is part of the debate. He introduced the Chinese exclusion law in 1882.
Part of the California constitutional.
Well, yeah. Well, that was actually So he ended up being the one who introduced this in the U.S. Senate, and so what ended up happening is that economic downturn, led to this kind of growing restiveness around this issue, and what it was is that the country was really evenly divided politically, and so. It sounds very familiar. So economic conditions, restive white workers, and a polarized country. And the Republicans and the Democrats were kind of vying for political supremacy. And in order to, both parties realized that in order to kind of, capture the White House, capture control of Congress, they needed to win the West. And in order to win the West, California, Washington, Oregon, you need to be as aggressively anti-Chinese as you could be. And so this is how the party of Lincoln, which stood for ostensibly equal rights and that kind of thing, ended up being just as vociferously and just as ugly in their rhetoric as the Democrats.
I mean, I thought that quote, which obviously is very ugly, was not out of line with what a lot of people were saying. I mean, according to your book.
Yes,
that's right.
Yes,
but then let's just talk briefly about. I mean, what really happens that you reconstruct in truly amazing detail is this wave of violence that that starts in Eureka, I guess, right?
So there was violence before. There's a chapter that took place in 1871. This is the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre, which the largest mass lynching in American history did not involve Black Americans. Actually, it involved Chinese. It was like 18 people
in Los Angeles.
Yeah, were killed, and I think 16 of them were lynched or something like. My math might be slightly off, but most of them were lynched. But what happened is in this kind of wave, this driving out period, what happened is 1882, you passed the Chinese Exclusion Law, and
which said
which banned Chinese laborers from entering the country for 10 years. And, but it essentially meant that all Chinese were banned, because there was this whole thing of like, if you were a merchant, you could still enter, but then there was all kinds of, they were doing these physical exams. If you had calluses on your hands, oh, you must be a laborer, you know, that kind of thing. So what happened was the Chinese were still coming, though, after this law passed. They were finding ways around the law. They were claiming they were merchants. There was, you know, a growing number who were saying that they were born in the United States, and it was difficult to kind of prove that or disprove that. Basically, they kept coming, and communities on the West Coast decided to take matters into their own hands. And in Eureka, which is in Humboldt County, upper reaches of California, there was this Chinese quarter that had about 300 Chinese in it. And there was basically an accident where a city council member was walking down the street, and these rival Chinese factions were arguing, and they were shooting at each other, and a stray bullet hit this council member, and he died. And you know, they basically, you know, people in the community kind of descended on the Chinese quarter and forced them, basically hunting down individual Chinese, forcing them to, you know, assemble at the docks, and they ended up forcing them on 2 ships to San Francisco. You know, the one of the craziest things in Eureka is I found a kind of like it's almost like a tour book that was published by you know, officials in Eureka and Humboldt County, kind of advertising, come to Humboldt County. We have beautiful, you know, weather, you know, there's, you know, lots of opportunity, and we are the only city without any Chinese, without any Chinamen. This is like this book that they circulated, and it was fairly late, like, you know, like late early 20th century, and so that was kind of the start, and then you know, then you ended up having this massacre that took place in Rock Springs, where 28 Chinese miners were killed. This Chinese quarter was burned down, and then it was just kind of like a domino effect, and it just happened.
Sort of rolling massacres, right?
Yeah.
City after city.
Yeah, city after city.
You then said,
In some cases, people weren't killed, but it was just kind of herded, you know, kind of, and just kind of given a deadline of, you know, you have to leave in 24 hours, and many Chinese ended up retreating to San Francisco as kind of like a sanctuary, as kind of like a ghetto, essentially, for Chinese. And yeah, and it's a part of American history. You know, I think about how this period, this is like this kind of crucial period of formation for the United States. The Reconstruction was, you know, essentially vanquished in the South. You know, there indigenous people were being expelled in the West, and you know, we as a country have actually, I think, you know, have had a reckoning with that, and have talked about that. But people forget that this was at the same time this was happening. The Chinese exclusion was happening, and then the driving out was happening, and we have to kind of think about that together.
I mean, that's because those are obviously slavery's abolished.
Right.
And
Yeah.
at the same time, and these things are playing off each other, and there's the 14th
Yeah.
Amendment, and then there's
Yeah.
a discussion about, well, does the 14th Amendment really apply to which is where right? I mean, how does it all, they seem like they're sort of working they're sort of against each other, or.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think the 15th Amendment, you know, which granted the right to vote
Right.
to formerly enslaved Black Americans, almost didn't pass because people were worried that it would include the Chinese, and there was kind of a big part of the discussion was, just making clear that no, the Chinese won't be able to vote. And so, the thing that when you talk about the 14th Amendment, the thing that everyone is very much on our minds today is birthright citizenship, and so that I hope people know the name Wong Kim Ark at this point. So the 14th Amendment says that if you are born in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you are a citizen of the United States. And what was happening in that period towards the end of the 19th century is there was this legal theory. There's a lawyer named George Collins who he's kind of a kooky guy, who started to circulate this theory in law journals and to really anybody he could kind of talk to, that the Chinese shouldn't count, because he made this argument about that clause, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. He was trying to say that because the parents of Chinese who were born in the United States were subjects of the Chinese Empire, they were not subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld birthright citizenship. I think that if you read the law, the decision on birthright citizenship, the justice, it's really dense with all the stuff about common law, and I think it was Gray, and but he kind of like is running through the implications if they overturn this,
Right.
and he's like,
he basically says, see that last paragraph to uphold.
all right, yeah. To hold that the 14th Amendment of the Constitution excludes from citizenship the children born in the United States of citizens or subjects of other countries would be to deny citizenship to thousands of persons of English, Scotch, Irish, German, and other European parentage who have always been considered and treated as citizens of the United States. So that was like beyond the pale.
This was right.
Like we couldn't.
This was not really about like making sure that Chinese were citizens. It was making sure this didn't like knock out all these
exactly.
white people from Europe.
Yeah, and then the thing that's actually less known about Wong Kim Ark that's incredible is like this didn't end his problems with U.S. immigration. He ended up in near El Paso, Texas, kind of at the Mexican Texas border, and a Chinese inspector, as they called it, like the kind of immigration inspector, arrested him there and detained him. And I mean, I think he knew who he was, because like the local newspaper reported that this kind of notorious kind of Chinaman is being held, and eventually he paid a fine, and then he was released. And the story and then what ended up happening though is he had sons who were in China who are because he is an American citizen, they are American citizens, and so they're trying to come into the United States, and they're being interrogated, and one of them actually was sent back, and but three of them actually, after lengthy detentions, were admitted. The thing that's kind of just incredible, because like there is a little bit of like, oh, this is ancient history, but like I actually got to meet the grandson of Wong Kim Ark.
It's not that long ago.
Yeah, actually, it's not that long ago. This guy named Norman Wong, who's in his 70s, but for most of us, like he didn't even know his own personal connection to this history. And
speaking about this not necessarily being history from so long ago, I mean, this exact same debate was in the Supreme Court. Like
a couple of weeks ago, they're debating that same clause, subject to the jurisdiction thereof.
Exactly. By the way, when it was on appeal, the government lawyer said this really needs to go to the Supreme Court, because he says it is a very important question that should be settled for all time. And then now
evidently not.
Evidently not.
Yeah.
But the whole story of that you so amazingly recount here, I mean, really resonates today. You don't read this really as ancient history.
Yeah, I mean
You have the same kind of dynamic of the
yeah,
country needing cheap labor and the
yeah,
country hating the cheap laborers.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
not to be
yeah.
too reductive, but
Yeah, I
kind of
mean
the way it
the
works.
parallels are incredible. I mean,
But
I
I mean,
say,
even like you talk about this Angel Island,
yeah,
this
yeah,
terrible detention center,
yeah,
which, you know, if you read about the
yes, we know a
current
little bit about detention
there's a
center.
lot of
Yeah. No,
um,
yeah, the entire apparatus, immigration enforcement apparatus that exists today grew up because of Chinese immigration. You know,
but it's
before,
also the sort of, it's not just, I mean, it's certainly the apparatus, but it's also just the issues are
yeah,
just,
yeah, exactly. Like like I mentioned, the fact that this happens because of political, a very politically polarized, environment, the economic conditions. It does feel very familiar. The book, the title of the book, "Strangers in the Land," comes from a Supreme Court decision where. Uh, a justice is upholding one of the Chinese exclusion laws, and he calls the Chinese strangers in the land because he kind of talks about how they can't assimilate with us. And what I say in the introduction of the book is that it's not just the story of the Chinese in America. It's the story of any number of immigrant groups who have been treated as strangers, who are currently being treated as strangers, and it's the story of America. It's the story of us, and a big thing that I have wanted in when I for this book is, um, you know, I don't want. I love that this audience here today is like a diverse audience. I've talked to audiences that were heavily Asian American, but I've also talked to audiences that are incredibly diverse. And what I always say is that Asian American history is American history, um, and it's been interesting for me because you know when I think about who I want to read this book, I wanted the dad who goes and buys the Civil War history or the World War II history, or people who love Patrick Keefe and say nothing. Like I want that same audience to read this book, and it's been interesting. I think it's still a challenge. I have a
have your daughters read the book?
as my daughter's read the book.
Supposed
So
to say
my
yes.
my younger daughter Vivian, who is 12, who is of that age, that's glorious age of 10, 11, 12, who they love you. They're real, they're real people. I mean, she's like amazing. She's super cute. She likes to read. She's like, Dad, I really need to read your book. Like that's like terrible if I don't read your book. And so she read, pretty far in, and I told her, please, because I want her to love reading and just like kind of, and I was like, you don't have to read the whole book. And so
You just have to buy it.
she has paused. My 17-year-old, where if you have a 17-year-old, the relationship's a little more complicated. She has not read it. She's apparently interested in history. She has an internship at the New York Historical Society. She's working on a project about significant court cases relating to Asian American history, and I'm like, I can help you with this. And so she's not read it.
She'll read it eventually. It's a nice thing about a book. It sticks around for a while.
Yeah,
And children.
yeah, but I mean, it's interesting. I have a Barnes and Nobles that's across the street from my apartment. So I go visit my book, and we check if how many units have moved We were in the new and noteworthy section for a long time, and then it kind of migrates out, and then we were in the general history section, which I was really glad. Like, I was near Jill Lepore, which is what I want to be. And then they ran out of copies, and my book's not there. So I'm like the most annoying. My editors must be so annoyed because they have direct relationships with the buyers, and so they say, hey, you guys have run out at the Upper East Side location. The author knows, and so but the thing about it is so they need to restock right now, and so but I'm a little. So I went to the Strand in Union Square, and they have my book, but it's in this Asian American Studies section. There was this large. Is the Strand watching tonight? There was there was this kind of display. I'm being very personal here. There was this display kind of set up for America 250 that was about history, and there was John Meacham, there was,
Right.
I think Jill was probably there. There's American presidents. And,
Probably only three or four.
There were, I'm trying to remember what.
Your book was not there.
My book was not there. I was so annoyed. So, but that's what I'm talking about, I think I think there's still, it's not for a niche audience. It's meant for,
So at the end, you talk about, sort of the Chinese question. Can you ever be
this,
so going back to the lady on the street, and your question about your girls, and given the history you now know, now that you're not an imposter.
Yeah. Now I have something smart to say to the woman. I can just hand her my book.
Right, exactly. No, but I mean, knowing that
there's 160,000 words for you. Yeah.
No, but so does it make you optimistic given the situation in the country with immigration?
Yeah. So I'll say two things. One, the book is actually meant to be a hopeful book. There is, I talk about how the book kind of has, you think about narrative, and you think about a 3-act structure where the protagonist kind of confronts a series of obstacles, and there's kind of period of rising tension, and then there's kind of this resolution. And the protagonists of the book are kind of the Chinese people as a whole, and they kind of confront, all these kind of obstacles and this kind of driving out, but those efforts were not successful. The Chinese population declined for a while, and then in the 1920s kind of started to rise again. And, it wasn't until 1965 in the Immigration and Nationality Act signed by Lyndon Johnson where Chinese were finally, and other Asian immigrants were finally placed on equal footing with other immigrant groups. But here we are today, and I'm here and able to tell this story. The hardest question though is what would it really take, for my kids to feel belonging, and I don't really know the answer to that question. Obviously, numbers relates to that. It's in not very distant future, Asian immigrants were the largest immigrant group in the United States. That will be part of it. Obviously, representation on television and popular media and movies and things like that is part of it. And I do think knowing. Having this lens of history and knowing that Asian American history is American history is going to be part of that. Are you signaling that it's time's up?
Maybe you can work in when you answer questions about some of your research, how you do the research.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Hi, thank you for being here. So clearly there was an enormous amount of research, and I'm wondering, you said that you hadn't gone into this really knowing too much. What was the most surprising? What was the thing that maybe most blew your mind when you saw it on the microfiche or what have you?
I think Well, I guess I'll say the sometimes you make discoveries, and there was like this when I set out on this project. It was during the pandemic, and we were working remotely. My kids were working remotely. We actually moved to San Francisco for my family, we moved to San Francisco for like 6 weeks, and so I could kind of do this really initial run through a lot of the archives that are in the Bay Area and on the West Coast. And I went to the California Historical Society in San Francisco, and they had this little red ledger book. It was like 5x7, like beaten and kind of battered, and it was full of photographs of Chinese people. And it was just this extraordinary thing because, like, photography had just kind of gotten its start in the, mid 19th century, and so my whole thing in this is kind of trying to humanize the people I'm writing about, and kind of that's why there are all these kind of little microbiographies, as the Times Review talks about. And this was amazing document because you could actually see these people. But then I was like, what is this? What is this book? And the people at the historical side didn't know. And then I started to look into it because there was like these little clues. Like there was like a name on the front. There was like it said it belonged to a Constable John T. Mason, Downeyville, California. And actually, Erica Lee, who's like this giant historian of Asian American history, really well known, she had included photographs from this book in one of her books, and but she didn't know exactly what the origins of the book was. And so what it was one important thing to know is that Chinese exclusion was not one law, but it was kind of a series of laws that just got, because the law was for 10 years, and then it would get renewed, and then it would get worse and worse. And in 1892, the law, Chinese exclusion law that passed, required that all Chinese residents in the United States register and be photographed. And it's actually an extraordinary story, if you'll indulge me. The Chinese 6 companies, which is kind of like this mutual aid kind of group that were kind of the leaders of the Chinese community, told all the Chinese in the country not to register, even though they faced the threat of deportation. And so all like 100,000 plus Chinese in the country, almost none of them registered. And they asked them to donate $1 to a legal fund to challenge the law, and it went all the way to Supreme Court, and they lost. And so then the Chinese started to come forward and register. And what I found was, I went back, and I benefited from digitization of records, and somebody had started digitizing, and it's not actually available in like newspapers.com or one of these searchable archives, which are amazing. But somebody had started to upload Mountain Messenger newspapers digitally, and I found this trove of them, and I just started looking in that period, and I discovered that the story was this guy John T. Mason. This town in Downeyville, which is a gold mining town, old gold mining town, had told the Chinese to come forward and register. And this guy John T. Mason, who was the constable in Downeyville, had a brother-in-law who was a photographer, and so he came from the neighboring town, and then for 2 days, all the Chinese came in and were photographed, and their names were listed. And then you start to actually see like little stories, like there was a mother and son that you found, once you kind of looked at the names and the census records and things like that. And then the thing that was really eerie was that he evidently kind of tracked the Chinese in his community over decades, which he didn't have to do. That was not required under the law. And so he noted things like gone back to China for good and told never to return. Like that was like a notation. And then there were things that were you know, really even more frightening. Like there were a lot of people whose names were like killed, died, you know, burned. That was like one notation, was burned. And so, you know, just discovering like the story of this was just kind of incredible. Like one of those kind of eureka sort of moments, and forms a section of a chapter.
Sure. What can people of color do so that we can all be looked at as Americans?
Big question.
In 2 minutes or less.
Yeah, in 2 minutes or less. I mean, one thing I was telling Matt about before, because I got a similar question to this a little bit. I was on the Daily Show with Ronnie Chang, and if you want to sell books, I recommend going on the Daily Show. But the thing that really sold, like you can see like a little chart, there's like, it's spiked, was actually, there was like one question that Ronnie Chang asked me that they posted on social media and went viral. It went got like 2 million views in like 48 hours. And he asked me this question about, he's like, what do you say to MAGA Asians? Like, they're kind of like, there's a group of kind of, you know, MAGA Asians who kind of they read he's like, what do you do about MAGA Asians who read a book like this and it's like, see, like this is, we need to just take care of our own, you know, we don't need to care about any other group. We should just end affirmative action. And you know, like, and that was the question. Hard question to answer live. And what I kind of talked about is I actually relate a lot to that, the feeling and emotion behind that these folks are feeling, because it relates to this kind of feeling of invisibility that a lot of Asian Americans feel, that our story is not part of the American story. It's our story, you know, doesn't count, or but I think that those folks are kind of making the same mistake in a certain way, where they're not understanding history. Like, so if you read my book and you kind of understand, you know, some of this background, but if you actually, history builds empathy. Knowing history builds empathy, and you know, you know, for example, like around the same time, they would basically like, you know, Republicans basically gave up, withdrew federal troops from the South, and basically just kind of got tired and gave up, and that's what led to, you know, Jim Crow and all these things. And you know, if you knew history, you would know that the advances of civil rights made by Black Americans benefit, you know, all benefit Asian Americans and many other groups. And I feel like if you know history and you see things through the lens of history, it builds this kind of kinship and allyship that you're talking about.
Okay, one more question. Oh.
Thank you.
Hi, Jody.
Hi, Mike. I remember when you came in after the incident on the Upper East Side to the paper, and I guess my question is, did that woman ever get back in touch with you?
No, I haven't. No, weirdly, like, yeah, no, I have not.
She shop at the Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, no, I should just kind of walk around on the Upper East Side carrying my book and like, you know, are you that woman? You know, no, yeah, which is a little surprising, I guess.
Maybe she was ashamed.
Yeah.
I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Michael and Matt for this incredible conversation. And so will you all just please give them a hand?